Good morning. We left off last time with the reconstruction of the Union, or at least the failed attempt at reconstructing the Union. So today now we start moving west and we start looking at the myriad of other issues and or topics that are going to distract the North from focusing on what Reconstruction should have been. Whether it's westward movement, whether it is that inevitable manifest destiny push towards the expanding of our yearly multiplying millions as that manifest destiny those had always encouraged. We're going to tame the frontier. We're going to start relegating the Native Americans to reservations so that, and in this very paternalistic, racist sort of ideology that is coming out of the American government at the time, start to put them onto the unused lands or the less productive lands so that the lands of the West could be utilized by Americans for our industrial immigration and or manifest destiny purposes. Now, in order to tame the frontier, you do need to deal with the Native Americans. And of course, these areas that were unused, that were deemed suitable for the Native Americans, are quickly disappearing. You'd had the plains, you'd had Utah, you'd had Montana, you'd had all of these areas that, because of just a lack of population density in America, they were available for Native American habitation. Well, white settlers are continuing to push further and further west into competition with the Native American native economic structures that had been either farming, livestock, hunting, fishing, trading, and even at times raiding against other Native American parties and raiding, of course, against white settlements that are moving out into the frontier. Now, everything about Native American life was living upon the land, not changing the land to adapt them. Balance with nature, hunts. If the hunts don't go well, you fish. If the fishing doesn't yield food, well, then you live off the buffalo. You live off of whatever else you could raid and or pillage from your neighbors. There was a certain amount of balance within nature that white settlers aren't necessarily going to live within. Now, as we look around the different regions, there was some sheep farming, particularly in the Northwest. You use salmon. On the plains, of course, the iconic image of the American buffalo or bison being utilized, and every part being utilized by Native Americans to subsist and to thrive. But as we get into the 1850s, even before the Civil War, this balance of nature and living with nature is going to start to unravel, and it's going to start to have some very devastating effects for Native American cultures as we move forward. And it is a convergence, a very nasty convergence of environmental as well as deliberately induced causes that are going to lead to the destruction of the buffalo on the frontier. Okay? So General Sheridan, if he's looking from a purely military standpoint, this is the way that you deal with, and this is the way you can bring down that delicate economic balance and ecological balance of Native Americans that depend upon the buffalo for survival. You kill them, you skin them, you sell them until they are gone. You destroy that economic way of life. And to that end, railroad companies that are looking to civilize these areas, build railroads, and of course, subjugate the Native Americans on these territories, they're looking, and they have a serious interest in destroying the buffaloes as well. So they'll sponsor buffalo trains where you'll take a 50 caliber rifle and drive through the plains until you reach a herd of buffalo, and then you just shoot into the herds. And they would pay $1 to $3 a hide. Sometimes they wouldn't even bother to pick up the hides as well. Now, Native American and some of the tribes are also going to get in on the sale of buffalo hides. Those prices being a little bit too good to give up, and they would trade them for all the supplies that they could possibly need, including rifles and or horses. Uh, Now, the buffalo, before the trains, before the mass shootings, before everything, they were already under stress. And if we live in Texas right now, we can understand the ebbs and flows of generational droughts. And the 40s and the 50s were already very dry drought conditions, and therefore the forage that they need, the water that they need, is already under threat, and therefore the buffalo as a species were already under strain. So at that point, when settlers are moving out to the frontier, they're bringing their sheep, they're bringing their cattle, they're bringing their horses, everyone's fighting over the same grass, the same water. And it's going to be the water that becomes the real difficult problem, as we've just suffered through some of the hottest days on record. What we can imagine is the water drying up, all of these animals coming in, and cattle and sheep and horses with their natural occurring bovine diseases that have been brought from Europe. Well, the buffalo had never seen any of this. So what we're seeing is almost a genocidal effect that we saw in the first half of this class with smallpox and influenza coming to the Native American populations. Well, now you're seeing bovine diseases being brought from Europe to the bison herds, and they're going to start to winnow out and die away. And so, as I said at the start, this is a nasty convergence of both human and environmental causes, and it weakens the herds to the point that once you just start shooting en masse, the buffalo herds by the 1880s were rendered down to maybe a few hundred. Out of the millions that once there, a few hundred start to occur. Now, the same thing is going to happen in the Northwest as you move into the Oregon and the Washington country. These territories are going to be similarly afflicted with damming, with overfishing, with the destruction of native river courses, and the destruction of ways of life that had traditionally existed in these areas for centuries, if not millennia. Now, some of the images that come up from this, you get piles of herds that show at least 40,000 in Dodge City, Kansas there. And what do you do with the bones if you bother to collect the carcasses? Well, you pile them all up and you start to sell them in terms of the ability to take the longer bones, grind them up, and use them for fertilizer, or the skulls for decorative purposes of the large males. So this is a wholesale pillaging and plundering of the environmental ecosystem of the West, and it is going to have a transformative effect on Native American culture. And as you move out into the West, as we send further and further, or we send more and more settlers further and further out into the frontier, what we're left with is that change in terms of demographics out onto the frontiers. The initial prospectors moving out onto the frontier, young, male, unmarried, trappers, traders, soldiers, prospectors, all armed with very limited qualms about using violence against anything or anyone. And this is in large part due to the opinion that has been pervaded about who and what the Native American cultures are. The perception in the media back in the East was that the Native Americans were devious or cruel or in some way godless heathens because they don't worship the Anglo-Saxon Christian God, whether it's Catholic or Protestant denominations of all kinds of different flavors. So that made them godless and heathens, and of course the tales of violence become manifest, and the mutilations, which were a part of Native American cultures and had been a part of European cultures in earlier generations, had disappeared from the European cultures and the American culture, and therefore that image is reinforced by day-to-day newspaper tales of cruelty out on the frontier. Now you put that group of young, violent population who view the Native American population as a negative and you bring that into conflict with the native counterparts who are, again, young, armed, and within the ethos of the culture, believe that bravery and valor and the extraction of vengeance, again, against the white settlers that are moving into their territory, as some, certainly as something that is highly regarded, to die in battle and to die in vengeance of white interlopers is going to be something that's highly valued and highly prized. Therefore, warfare, conflict, skirmishes, raids, and retributions are going to continue back and forth. Now, there was either a lack of understanding or a willingness to ignore the diversity of cultures. And in American society, or even when it was still colonial, you either didn't want to recognize or you failed to recognize the diversity of culture. Okay? And they are divided into hundreds of bands with villages and confederacies all across North America. The dialects are wide-ranging, and the ability of one so-called chief to speak for the whole of the people is misunderstood or deliberately misunderstood, because we simply want to be able to sign a treaty. Well, we can sign a treaty with one group of a couple of hundred natives for a little small area, and we as the white Americans are going to, as the American government, are going to assume that that one chief speaks for the whole of the Sioux Nation, and we fail to recognize that there are probably 50 subcategories of Sioux within that broader linguistic area. And so the chiefs will not have those wide-ranging powers and will either ignore it or just not understand it. And will also be aided by the American attempt to subjugate the Native Americans, be aided by the simple fact that they are historically hostile with each other. That even within the broader dialectic groups, the subgroups and the different variations of the tribes, they are historically hostile with each other. Now that, in so many different ways, is going to aid American attempts to subjugate the Native Americans. When we sign a treaty as the American government, we view it as an expedient. We never view it as a guarantee. In fact, some of the treaties are signed one week, violated the next, and our view of the Native Americans, and when I say our, I mean the American government's view, was that the Native Americans were a hindrance to the development of America by white settlers. Now, this is, again, characterized by a very paternalistic, very racist view of who the Native Americans are, what their prospects are, and what our obligations are to these people. And the next 20 years in reservation policy is one of the more shameful episodes in American history, and one of them that we still continue to struggle with reckoning of the consequences of our policies. But as we move into this area, the general mindset was that we had to civilize these people, right? And in that way, we wanted them to become more American, and that we wanted them to give up the tribal ways of life, that we wanted them to give up the hunting and gathering and serve for farming and for commerce. And we wanted to instill a certain amount of Protestant work ethic. We wanted to Americanize the Native Americans. And this is going to be a strain of paternalistic and naive thought that is going to pervade all of American history as we move through, particularly this Gilded Age period, that our foreign policy is going to be guided by that everyone should want to be Americans, and they should hold our economic values, they should hold our social values, and they should hold our religious values. And so our attempts, and it starts in the 1830s when you start to see Native Americans pushed out of Georgia to Oklahoma, and it continues as we start to see Native Americans being relocated to further and further western lands, more remote lands, as we find resources on these lands that are occupied by Native Americans desirable, whether it's farmland, whether it is agricultural land, access to water, or mineral deposits that are going to be available on some of these lands. Now, prior to the 1800s and the 1760s, the Native American allies were essential. We had a trade relationship based on a certain amount of necessity and equality. And so we traded horses and guns for furs, jewelry, and alliances against either the French or the British in the various wars that are ongoing. And that even continues into the early 18 teens in the War of 1812. But by the 1870s, we'd really surpassed in terms of economic power. The market economy forces had surpassed the Native Americans to the point that we're now dictating all terms, and there is no longer a sense of equality in terms of our trading relationship. The United States has removed all of the economic and the political rivals from the North American continent, and therefore all of those rivalries are down. There's really no need to make nice with the Native Americans any longer. And so the economic power of America as it starts to industrialize means that there is a much more dependent relationship of the natives on the United States, and our relative military power in terms of sheer resources, men, material, weapons, and the sophistication of our weapons means that we're going to be aided in the forcing and the imposing of reservation policies onto the Native Americans. Now, to show how Americanized some of these Native American tribes had become, just like in 1830 with Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, they appeal to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is dominated by people who see the West in similar fashion, and the Native Americans are classed not as citizens with no protections under the 14th or 15th Amendments. They're classed as wards of the state, and therefore the reservation policy is going to be deemed constitutional, with the Native Americans having no real legal recourse to the land that they have occupied for a millennia. And so the reservation policy continues, combining bands that have been for centuries hostile with each other at each other's throats in warfare over lands and over supremacy. We're now going to combine them onto a few 100,000 acres, forcing them to live elbow to elbow with tribes that we have been forever hostile with. I don't know, to put it into perspective, and not to make light of anything, but you're combining Longhorn and Aggie fans right at Thanksgiving. Tribes that have been historically hostile with each other, acrimonious with each other, and you're forcing them to sit at the same table and watch a football game together. It's not that the Aggies and Longhorns play anymore, but to my generation, when you think of sports animosity, that's it. You're forcing Michigan and Ohio State to stay at the same table. The natural outcome is going to be violence, warfare, anger, okay? And continuing farmers moving in, miners moving in, herders moving in. The reservations are going to routinely be scaled down, and the lands available to the Native Americans continue to shrink. And I'll show you a map here at the end of this slide that gives you an idea of how much land was initially given, and then how it starts to pare down, how it starts to go away. In the end, with all of the wars, and there are some famous wars, and and famous war chiefs that resist, Sitting Bull and Geronimo, those wars continue. And in the end, the Native Americans aren't necessarily conquered. They're just harassed, harangued, starved into submission, and beaten down by generations of attritional warfare on the frontier, to the point that they wind up living and being forced on to reservations here. And here you have some of the more famous battles, whether it's massacres, Wounded Knee, Little Bighorn, and you see some of the tribes, the Mojave, the Navajo, the Paiute, the Utes, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Arapaho, and of course the Sioux, some of the more famous tribes that you can think of. And here you see by 1900 where the reservations had been found. Mining and all kinds of other interests will see you take large sections of Oklahoma and of the Dakotas and of Montana away from Native Americans and force them firmly into much smaller particular areas. All right. Now, as we move into the 1880s, we are going to see some idea of reform coming around. Reformers and campaigners are looking to uplift some of the Native Americans and perhaps instill in what they see are the middle class working values of Protestant American. What do they need to do? They need to basically destroy the communal identity, the tribal identity of these Native Americans. In 1887, that shift in Indian policy brings some reform and reverses some of the reservation policy. Instead of a tribe being awarded a reservation territory, what we wanted to do is instill, for a more modern term, home ownership and pride of ownership of land into the Native American community. And so what you do is for every member of this tribe, you give them their own personal allotment. And we're trying to instill home ownership. You're trying to instill property ownership and thrift and ambition and, well, the materialistic and the consumeristic ideas that America is looking to instill the Native Americans with. Now, the allotments are going to be held in trust for 25 years so that they can't be sold and they can't be predated upon by speculators. And what they wanted to do is grant citizenship to those who took their allotments, and the allotments that were unused, what they wanted to do was sprinkle white settlers within the Native American settlers. So you're trying to gentrify these areas and you're trying to move white settlers and mix them into Native American settlers to further try to dilute the community identity of Native Americans. Now, American policymakers at the time saw this as an enlightened thing to do. They saw that as the right thing to do to try to Americanize the tribal organizations. Introducing the notion of private property, introducing the notion of materialism into this culture would further make them American. Now, as we get into further lectures, we'll see that put into place with the immigrants, the non-traditional immigrants that are going to start to come in the 1870s, 1880s into America. And so we're going to do the same thing with our native population. We're going to do that with the Poles, the Slovaks, the Czechs, the Romanians, the new immigrants that are going to start to flood into America as we move forward. And to take the younger generation, you wanted to take the children of Native Americans and you wanted to send them away to boarding schools to further Americanize them. Now, unfortunately, this is a disastrous policy. It's going to take children who are going to be educated in Protestant schools or even Quaker schools in the West, or sorry, in the East, which means by the time that they finish their education and they go home, they're no longer accepted as readily into their Native American culture, and of course they'll never be accepted into white American culture because of the color of their skin in the 1880s. So they're left inferior in both worlds, and again, just a reprehensible policy that was thought to be for the best, but given the racial ideas and given the misguided ideas of America at the time and the American government at the time, it is going to be disastrous. And no matter what happens with this 25-year trust in terms of the allotments, the holdings of Native American peoples within these reservations and these private allotments drop precipitously in the next 40 years. So almost immediately, speculators try to move in and start to encroach, and despite government prohibitions of sailing lands, what they'll do is they'll sell them now, and the deed will transfer in a few years when it becomes legal, but white settlers and white speculators would take possession almost immediately. So if you don't rigorously follow up this policy, it becomes disastrous. Now, here's a very famous image of some of these children that were taken away, Chiricahua Apache children that were taken from their home and then sent to Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. And you send them to a Quaker school, give them a Western haircut and a Western education, and it is a far cry from their traditional upbringing. And these Apache children are going to be, well, I don't want to say outcasts, but they're going to be looked down upon in both societies as they go forward. Okay, and that's just another copy of that map, showing you the scale of how much land is lost and how much is taken. And as we move into the 40s and the 50s, you're going to see that reservation policy continue to shrink down. Now, the reason we're moving west is, of course, going to be the extraction of mineral resources. And the prospectors are going to be the first to move out onto these frontiers. I don't know if you can remember an image, and I should have brought it up, but I think it's at the end of this lecture. When we talk about, when we raise the idea of manifest destiny, you have, Lady Columbia leading everyone out into the frontier. And the first moving into the frontier are going to be your prospectors. They're out there picking for gold, for silver. And as we start to industrialize, copper, zinc, so many other minerals are going to become essential to the industrial process and tend that the push west. And we always hear about the famous 49ers, and we hear about the Comstock lode in particular for the extraction of silver. But copper, lead, zinc, tin, if we're industrializing and trying to build the machines of the industrial age, those materials are less heralded, less famous, but those are equally lucrative moving into the industrial age. Now, the lone prospector, he's out there on his own, picking for gold, picking for silver. Now, he finds something enormous. The Comstock lode is that famous example of it. A large underground silver strike in Nevada. Now, to get it out of the ground, you need heavy machinery, you need engineers, you need timber, you need the well material, machinery, you need everything. Just simple, one guy out there is always going to be forced to give way to the larger corporations. Okay? Transporting those sheer amounts of materials is going to require a rail line. It's going to require heavy machinery. It's going to require labor, and that a single prospector can't. And the Comstock lode really typifies it. Of the 6 major early prospectors that find the Comstock lode, I think they sold out their share of it for roughly $30,000-$40,000, which was still a fair amount of money at the time, but probably a couple $100,000 in today's money. But the Comstock lode, in all of its wealth, is going to flood the market with silver, which is going to be important for our economics discussion in a couple of lectures, but it's also worth billions in today's money. And there's almost this folklore of the curse of the Comstock lode, because all of the original settlers died under suspicious circumstances, if not suicide and depression. Now, none of the original prospectors had the financial resources to realize that claim. They also didn't know what they had, and so it's almost a sense of, what have I done? I sold this for Jack and the Beanstalk kind of way. I traded it away for a set of magic beans. But it does show the corporate and the industrialization of the extraction of these materials. Now, if you're building an underground mine, you've got to shore it up, which meant timber. And so in the Northwest Territory, we are going to slash and cut enormous forests for the building of railroads and rail lines, and the use in mining and everything else. And so whether it's construction, whether it's building back in the east, or the building of railroads, or the production of charcoal for heating. All of this is going to put a heavy toll on our forested areas in the West. Now, some of the forest for heating and for lighting is going to catch a break with the discovery of and the utilization of oil reserves in California and East Texas. They'll start to be used for natural gas for lighting, fuel, of course, as we start to develop gasoline in the internal combustion engine, as well as lubrication on these massive locomotives. All of this is going to run at pace, and so oil reserves are going to become vitally important to America. Now, as all of this is booming, the West becomes the land of opportunity. The West becomes that, as Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis is going to give us, it's going to be the source of American greatness. Because if you don't like your lot in life in the city, in the East, wherever you are, pick it up and move out to the West, and with your two hands and rugged individualistic ideas, you can make a life for yourself. And that's what leads to an incredibly mixed and diverse society out there. Freedmen, Native American, Mexican, Chinese, all added to the white settlers mix as we move out into the frontier. And it leads to this, again, the inculcation of the American ideology of rugged individualism. And it also leads to more states taking the opportunity to become states within the Union. They hit the territorial markers, they form a legislature, they draw up a constitution, they vote, and they have it submitted to the 1880s, 1889, North and South Dakota, Washington, Montana are added, Wyoming and Idaho, and eventually Utah in 1896 after nominally promising to give up the Mormon practice of multiple wives. And so our frontier and our map is going to start to take shape, and our environment is going to take a beating. The extraction of these resources is done by any means necessary. There are two different ways that you can get at some of these lodes and some of the mines. The building of sluices and the stripping away of entire mountainsides is one of them to expose the load-bearing rock, or you could go underground. This is, of course, the use of water and hydraulic mining, that you use pumps and these water cannons to strip away the topsoil, get to the load-bearing rock, and even in the topsoil you would have the water running down these sluices and the heavier minerals, particularly gold, accumulating within these sluices. Now, when we start talking about timber, you start just really harvesting forests on an industrial scale, all in part to build rail lines and bridges. And here you have a very rudimentary locomotive, but building of rail lines and building of these very complex and very timber heavy bridges going forward. And of course, all of the rail lines are laid down on these sleepers, which are lumber. Okay. So it's very important to the progress of our industrial nation to pillage and plunder the environment as we go forward. And it's that end that we start to see a conservation movement begin. The notion that the federal government has a role in the protection of this land because you're the primary owner of all of this land. Right? So you have a prime stake in trying to preserve it. And so you start to see some of the first publicly designated national parks or state parks being utilized, whether it's Yosemite or the Yellowstone being granted as our first national park. So conservation movement is gathering steam and is gathering force, but it really is a difficult thing to hold off the spoiling of our natural beauty when we're in such a boom to catch up to the British, to catch up to Europe and assume our role in the world stage via industrialization. You know, there is this grand push that we are somehow behind, that we need to catch up, that there is this time pressure that we need to rapidly industrialize, and we'll discuss that as we move forward. Okay. but the new states added to the Union, and you see, moving forward, our map is looking a little bit more like what we now can memorize and can consider. So all of these green states moved in as territories in the 1870s and added states and statehood into the 1880s and the early 1890s. So our American map is starting to take shape, and the lower 48 starting to look as we deem it to look. Now, to get across this massive nation, what do we got to do? We got to build railroads. Now, the railroads were around in the 1830s, the 1840s, and of course the 50s and the 60s. But what we're really seeing is post-Civil War a massive, massive boom, to the point that we're going to build hundreds of thousands of miles of track. To that point, by the 1900s, the U.S. contained a third of the rail lines in the world. And we are bypassing, and if you can see it up here, you know, in this image, the coach and the horses. We are traversing this great land of ours through the efficiency and the wonder of industrialization. And we're going crazy for rail lines. Now, if we're building railroads, what do we need? Well, we need steel. That is going to fuel industrialization. We need coal. That's going to fuel the mining industries. And of course, we need freight cars, we need passenger cars, we need towns and depots. All of this is going to spur all of our complementary industries that feed off of the rail lines. So this is an extreme complementary industry, and that we wouldn't have industrialization without the railroads, and you wouldn't have industrialization, you wouldn't have the railroads without industrialization. They feed off of each other. The production of steel via the Bessemer process in 1855 really fuels and makes large-scale rail locomotives and enormously powerful rail locomotives possible. You can build them with pig iron, but you can't build up enough pressure in their boilers to get a lot of speed and a lot of horsepower. Well, now with steel, the stronger material, I can build them lighter, I can build them thinner, I can build up more pressure, I can go faster, and I can carry more. So really, steel is the thing that makes the Industrial Revolution for us possible. And along the way, we build rail lines and depots and towns. And you're going to start to see towns springing up at the end of these lines. Chicago, Omaha, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. These are built as terminus for your rail lines. And our railroads are going to be built through some of the largest public subsidies that the government has ever granted. And we'll talk about that process as we go forward. Okay? The process being the public domain lands out there, and I can show you a map here in a brief second. You would grant a 20, maybe 80 mile wide strip of land to a rail company. That rail company would then use the land as collateral, as security for bonds sold to the public. You would sell some of the land, you would keep some of the land for yourself, and the government is going to grant you that land in the public domain out in the West. And you would use your powers of eminent domain to cross people's lands and settlers' lands out in the frontier. And so you would simply claim it, relocate, reallocate, or pay market value for the land that is being seized and a railroad going across it. Now, this process is going to be fraught with fraud, and we'll talk about that in the Gilded Age. One of the many reasons this period, the 1870s, the 1890s, is thought to be one of the most corrupt times in American history, and rightly so. But it's not just the federal government that are building these transcontinental railroads and that are, well, they're not building them, they are encouraging private entities to build them and making them possible. The capital outlay to build a rail line from Chicago to Seattle would have been ruinous from a private company. It would have never been built. Hence the federal government stepping in. Now, states and localities are also joining in on this. And what we can see in a lot of different ways is very similar to what was in the news recently. Del Valle out in Austin sees enormous grants of tax abatements to Tesla or to Apple in the north of Austin, in Cedar Park, or is it Round Rock, to build campuses and to build factories. The thought that if we give you this tax abatement, the coming of this Tesla Gigafactory is going to have greater economic boom than what we're giving up in property taxes. Well, counties like Ovalo, Texas, and Taylor County, just south of Abilene, well, they are raising money and issuing bonds to build a rail line to encourage economic development in West Texas. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been out there south of Abilene. The description of black land, mostly in cultivation, well, I grew up near Abilene. Land is not black out there. It is not incredibly fertile. It is not a cattleman's or a rancher's paradise out there. It happens a lot, but it's pretty dry, it's pretty barren, it's pretty flat. You know, it's right there on the beginnings of the plain that plains out towards Lubbock, to where, you know, there's nothing between you and Canada but a barbed wire fence at that point, and the barbed wire fence is down half the time. Well, Ovalo is going to be one of these failure stories. They build a rail line and they build a spur, and they're trying to start a town, but some towns take, some towns don't. Some become successful, some don't. And so everybody gets involved in these sale of bonds and the rush to build railroads, to the point that by the time we hit to the 1890s, we've got a saturation of rail lines, and some are profitable, some aren't. And that's also going to give us a dip in the economic productivity of America as we move into the 1890s. Okay? So Ovalo is that story, that cautionary tale, as we start to do all of this. And here's a map of the subsidies that were granted, and you see the Great Northern Line, the Western Line, the Southern Line. You even reserve some space down here, but in the end, you wind up building it from sort of Ruidoso, New Mexico area in these hills down towards Los Angeles. Okay? And of course, you go from Denver across, but the great cow towns that we'll talk about in the cattle drive here in the Midwest. You drive your cattle up to here and you sell them, and of course even further up here in Montana and the Dakota territories. And here you see this great push to rebuild some that were damaged in the Civil War in the South, but for the most part it's the connectivity of resources and physical resources out here with the markets and the materials and the industry in the East. And whether it's going to be the great steel, coal, and iron industry, or steel and iron and coal industries here in Pennsylvania, Ohio, what's commonly known as the Rust Belt today, they're already connected by rail lines here, and they're moving further and further west. So this great push of connectivity is coming for us. Okay? Now, this leads to a great reform in technology and in organization. Okay? Now, for us, when you think about it and you're building a railroad, a lot of these rail lines were built on spec. One individual company would build it based on whatever gauge of the track or gauge of the locomotives they were buying. And gauge means the distance between the two wheels. It seems such an obvious thing that, oh, they all should be the same width, and therefore you can take whatever locomotive onto whatever track. But in the 1840s and 1850s, that wasn't the case. The locomotives were custom built. There wasn't the push for standardization of everything. But of course, by the 1880s, you realize that that is eminently desirable, so that one car can go on all rail lines. Before, one locomotive and one set of cars may not be able to traverse the whole of the United States because of the differing gauges. That is a great technological reform that will increase the productivity of our rail network, as will air brakes, using of compressed air to slow down these hundreds of tons of material moving at pace, electric switches and automatic couplers on your cars, so that you don't physically have to couple them and do it by hand, because there are a lot of railwaymen that lose fingers, lose hands, are seriously injured because of the need to manually couple these locomotives and these cars. My great-grandfather and grandfather both worked in the railroads out of Fort Worth. And of course, they had a watch that was just like this. And my great-grandfather was missing on his right hand tips of his pinky and his ring finger because of a rail accident. So even with the automatic couplers, they were still dangerous. And all of that was rather difficult. Now, as you start going west, you go through mountains. Well, do you go over them? Well, engineering capacities in our programs and our ability to figure out the grades and our ability to accurately survey certainly leads to an improvement of our engineering programs in our American universities. And we certainly need to make sure the grading on some of these isn't too steep, so that we can go up and down these mountains or dig a tunnel through them. So we need to increase our university educational capacities to keep up with all of this. Now, the other is just going to be a national coordination of freight schedules to get a maximum productivity out of our rail line. I got to make sure that it runs on time, railway time. And that's why pretty much every employee of the railway had a watch that was hyper accurate and looked predominantly like that. Your pocket watches. The enduring image I have of my grandfather was of those railway overalls with his pocket watch in that pocket. And if you've never seen those railway overalls, they're a bluish gray with white stripes, and that's what he wore every day, even when he wasn't working. That was his go-to set of clothes. And that's the image I have of my grandfather. He passed away when I was still relatively young, but forever that will be frozen in my mindset. So everybody that's working on the rail, they need to have the same conception of time. Well, how did you set time, and how did you set midday and noon prior to the Industrial Revolution? You went outside and you looked to see where the sun was at, when it was directly over your head. Bang! You rang the church bells and you rang the bells and throughout the town. That was noon. Everybody knew to reset their watches. That's a world where you can't travel more than 30 or 40 miles in a day via horseback. So the precision of time doesn't necessarily need to be that accurate. But if I'm traveling 50, 70, 100 miles an hour, it is vitally important that everybody is on the same time. And therefore, in 1883, if you ever wondered where the time zones came from, they came from the railroads. They set up Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. They set up these time zones. They set up noon, so that you didn't have the deadly prospect of trains coming at opposite ways on a rail line because of a misconception of time. So that industry sets the standard. That industry made the setting of noon universal across that time zone. Now, it's also going to be aided by the telegraph, and so that within 10 to 20 seconds you could set a national average of noon. And you guys will never know the joy of trying to establish what the precise time was. There used to be a line that you could call, and at the sound of the beep, the time will be 12:56 p.m. Beep. That's how you figured out exactly what the time was. Either that or you're sitting in school and you're running it off the clock times. You know, all of this stuff predates nationally set times through cell phones and all the other things. Okay, so I'm feeling a little bit old at that point. You'll never know that joy. But anyway, set from an industry taking that impetus without Congress. And so that's how you get your time zones. Now, let's get to the other side. We take all of these settlers out there to the Midwest, and what are they doing? They're farming. Okay. Now, you see this guy here with his dugout and his sod house. When you get out there, you need two things. You need shelter and you need water. Well, shelter is going to be possible through mechanization, irrigation, and the development of well technology that could get deep enough to give you access to water. That's the thing that led people to call the plains and the Kansas and Nebraska territory the Great Midwestern Desert, because there's not a whole lot of surface water. Now, if you talk about the aquifers, whether it's the Edwards or the Ogallala or all of these, you go 150 feet beneath the surface, there are vast amounts of water, filtered water through the limestone, but you got to be able to get to it. Okay? Now, industrialization is going to feed farming on the plains through mechanization. Mechanization is going to allow these farmers to feed the immigrants that are working in the Industrial Revolution. And so here you have all of these factors coming together at exactly the right time to make the urbanization, the immigration, and the industrialization, as well as the expansion of the West possible. Farming on the plains would not be, on this industrial scale, on this big business scale, possible without the transportation to bring all of those products back to the west, to the east from the west. And through irrigation, through mechanization, these farmers are able to overcome enormous hardships to turn the heartland of America into that breadbasket, into the granary of the United States, if not the world. So who settles out here on the plains? And I don't know if any of you guys have ever lived out in the country. I grew up in a rural setting, and it's boredom. It really is boredom that will get you. And granted, I still lived close to a town of 2,000 people. If you can imagine moving out to the plains as a migrant or immigrant, millions of farmers pouring out onto the plains, busting the sod. And if you look at what his house is made of, and you think, oh, I'm gonna go out here and I'm gonna make a house. What's his house made of here? At the heat, at the peak of a Texas summer, if you were go out there and you look at these grasslands, they're dry, they're hard. You can chop them up and chop blocks that are held together by the roots of these native grasses, and you can get building blocks to build a house, which is what he's got, a sod house. Because there's not enough tree, there's not enough lumber, there's not enough of anything really, and you don't have the technology to carve out and quarry stone. What you do have are bits of tin or bits of wood that you could use for your roof, and here you have your chimney for your stove, but for the rest of it, and you've got kind of a wonky window and a side-on door there. But this would have been a rather damp, a rather dark house. And then you think, what else are you thinking? Well, if you don't have timber to build a house out of, what are you using for fuel in that stove? What's readily available all over the plains and that burns, and that's disposable. And you give up? Yeah, you guessed it, buffalo chips. The buffalo herd moves through, or cows move through. What do they leave behind? Manure. You leave that in the sun for a couple of days, and it becomes, well, essentially poorly digested grass. You pick that up, and you can fling that like a frisbee pretty well. You also pick it up, you can use it for fuel, for cooking, and for warmth. Imagine a Plains winter, a Kansas snowy winter with nothing to burn but poop. That's some significant hardships that you have to overcome as you're coming forward. Now, we're going to bring all these migrants, and we're going to bring all these, whether they're immigrants or urban American migrants, out to the frontier. They're going to become the backbone of our farming communities out here. The railroads are going to offer cheap land, very easy credit to buy that cheap land. Hell, they'll even give you a free ticket from the East Coast to the West Coast out there. And they're going to advertise all over Europe to, well, basically, people who don't want to live in an industrial world. If you've been a rural farmer all your life, do you want to go work in a factory? No. And so the railroads, they see that land that they were granted in lieu of building the railroads. I'm going to help realize some of that by selling it, and I'm going to offer credit to these people to help buy it so that I can create a market. If I've got a farmer out there, he's going to grow a crop, he's then going to be tied to the rail company to get that crop back to market. So what you're doing is creating markets unto yourself with the land that you have been granted from Congress. And so we're going to populate them with, well, we're going to populate the plains with farmers. Some will survive, some won't. Some farms will continue to prosper, some won't. But it is an incredibly difficult living. And we're going to advertise all over Europe. And of course, for some people who don't want to be an industrial, urbanized worker, whether it's the Irish, whether it's the English, whether it's the Germans, they're going to see America as the land of opportunity because they've got so much stinking land out there that they're just giving it away, or giving it away virtually free. And so there's going to be a huge uptick on it. But of course, an uptake and an uptick on it. But when you get there, that's when you realize, yeah, I've got an enormous amount of hardships. And here, this is an incredibly large sod house. Okay? You got your Yardbirds here, you got your windmill, all of this. Hell, he's even got some full-size windows here. And of course, you've got some tin up here, and you lay some sod down on that tin. But we all know just one good thunderstorm, it can lift that roof off and carry it all away. So you really are dealing with some enormous hardships out here on the frontier. You don't have a whole lot of wood. You don't have a whole lot of fuel. You don't have a whole lot of water. And heck, this past month has shown us, the summer months will show us that water is scarce in a lot of different ways. And so the result is to dig a well. Okay, well, some of the wells are hard to dig. And of course, the digging machinery and the windmills to pump that water is rather expensive. So it's a harsh life. And of course, here in Texas, what do we have to deal with? Well, heat. Heat and lack of rain. An occasional thunderstorm, occasional tornado. You get a little further north, well, guess what? You get all four seasons, and you get the worst of them. You get blizzards, you get floods, you get droughts, you get heat. And then let's throw some locust into the mix, because we haven't really talked about locust. And, you know, today we're familiar with the cicadas, and they're just noisy. We're talking about the Rocky Mountain locust that thankfully has probably been exterminated because, and I say thankfully, but climate change and the busting of the frontier, they thought that the Rocky Mountain locust used to go into hibernation every 7 years in Colorado. And the fact that we start to plow and we start to disturb and we start to disrupt their habitat, it's probably led to an end of the swarms of locusts that used to come. And if you still watch the news in Africa, you can still see swarms of locusts that periodically will come up. That biblical kind of plague. Well, 1874 saw the last of the great swarms, and they're judging the size of it based on the number of days it took for that swarm to pass locations. And they will leave the land stripped down to the roots. They eat anything in sight. And so it's almost like you're looking at 2020 and wondering, okay, what's next? Well, in the 1870s, you're looking at the frontier. All right, droughts and blizzards and tornadoes and fires. What's next? Oh, locust. Well played. Well played, frontier. Well played. And then just when you thought that they couldn't throw anything else at you, you realize you're out in the middle of nowhere and you're all by yourself. I mean, that is a rather depressing sort of situation to be in, where it's just you and your family 24/7, almost kind of like the quarantine, just you and your family. Now, 1862, you're going to see the government pass the Homestead Act. Okay, and this is also on the land that wasn't granted to the railroads. You could go out and get 160 acres for free, but here's the catch: you gotta live there. You gotta live there, and at some point, you gotta deal with all the hardships and all of the loneliness. Now, as we get into the 1870s, you start to see mail-order companies like Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. These were catalog companies, and but prior to the internet, they would issue a catalog of what they had. You would send in your order, and it would be delivered. And free rural delivery by the U.S. Postal Service starts to bring the farmers into consumerized society. You get letters, you get catalogs, you get newspapers, you get all of this stuff. And the free delivery is extended, RFD, rural free delivery, extended, and parcel posts start to go out there for free by the 19 teens. So you're starting to mitigate the isolation, but you got to survive at least the first 5 years in extreme conditions and extreme isolation. Now, a lot of this is going to be made better through mechanization of agriculture. Okay, we're going to mechanize some of our agriculture, and if we can harvest a crop, the prices were still very high. And as we get into the 1860s and the 1870s, innovations, seeders, combiners, binders, mowers, plows, they start to be carried west by the rail lines, and entire communities would invest in a steam-driven, and here you see it down here, a steam-driven tractor. And then at that point, you can collectively harvest faster, bind all of this, put it on a rail line, send it back to the east, and you can certainly increase your production and increase your profits. But the capital outlay for these machines were incredibly high. Now, you'll also see some of the dairy farms benefit with separators, and of course the electric or mechanized incubators mean poultry farming goes up. We're putting dairy products, we're putting milk, we're putting chicken onto the menu in vast quantities, and we're going to increase our production per acre exponentially through the use of mechanization. Our costs go down, prices go down. That'll sometimes mute some of the benefits to the farmers, but overall, as an American entity, food becomes more plentiful, it becomes more available. And this is what's also going to feed industrialization, because if I can farm 135 acres per person through mechanization, I don't need all the children to help farm the land. Those children become surplus labor and therefore can move to the cities and become part of our industrial workforce. And that's going to be part of this gradual trend of becoming a less rural, more urban population. Science is also going to give us new drought resistant or insect resistant strains of corn and of wheat. And that, of course, that means more production per acre with less labor needed. That, of course, means our production is up. We can start shipping around the world. We can feed our yearly multiplying millions. Farming is still an incredibly difficult endeavor, but through whether it's horse-drawn or oxen or cow-driven materials, mechanical reapers that will run on steam power are coming, and they're coming in great numbers. Now, the other cornerstone of this industry is going to be the ranching industry, okay? Near and dear to the hearts of all Texans. You know, in the 1500s, certain cows get away from the Spanish settlers, and you start to see the origins of our ranching culture in the 16 and the 1700s. And of course, the vaqueros, they teach their skills to white settlers. And by the 1860s, you'd realized I can take a $5 calf in Texas, feed it out for a year, march it up to Kansas, and sell it for $40. This is the heyday, the short-lived heyday of open range cattle farming. This is what's going to put beef on the menu for the masses in the East. And very much so, beef is still at the cornerstone of the menu for so many Texans and people elsewhere. Given climate change and given everything that's ongoing today, the efficacy of large-scale cattle farming is coming under pressure, but it really is something that hits the market here in the 1870s. Right? The cattle population in Texas explodes from 130,000 to 4.5 million, as does the methane and the byproducts of cows. You guessed it, cows fart a lot, and those cow farts are greenhouse gases. So that's one of those things that people are looking at in the efficacy of and the usefulness of continuing to eat beef in such a large scale. But we're not worried about that right now. Okay, we're going to, if you're a rancher, you would buy a little bit of land, a few hundred acres on a water access route, and then you would use the open range or free graze. You're on hundreds of thousands of acres that are out there to be grazed. Now, this would be a perfect system if it was only ranchers moving out to the frontier. But unfortunately, farmers, sheep herders, other agricultural activities are being had, and in particular, that competition becomes a little too much. But this cattle drive heyday of moving it from the open plains here in the hill country here in Texas all the way up to Abilene, to Dodge City, up here to Ogallala. If you've ever watched Lonesome Dove, you see them coming from South Texas here at Lonesome Dove and moving the Goodnight Loving Trail all the way up here, okay, through Dodge City and Ogallala up here to the Dakotas and to Montana. Okay. Now, you combine it with your Union Pacific Railway, and of course you've got your Kansas Pacific. You've got some of these out here, these great cow towns starting to pop up. But if I'm a farmer, do I want cattle rampaging across my crops? No. So what they always say, good fences make for good neighbors, right? Well, good fences will make for good neighbors on the frontier if you're a farmer. And this fine gentleman smoking a stogie there is Joseph F. Glidden. Okay, he develops the first patent given for barbed wire. Barbed wire is one of those things that can keep some of the cattle off of your land. Now, you get an amorous inspired bull, barbed wire means very little to him. But for the most part, you're going to start to enclose your land and keep cattle off of it using barbed wire. Now, this is an industrial boom. This is a materials boom. And again, feeds the Industrial Revolution. Because from 1873 to 1880, you're going to see an explosion of the production of barbed wire. So this will cement the dominance of farming on the plains and kill the cattle drive economy almost as quickly as it started. You really only have about 10 to 15 years of that cattle drive free range idea before it is severely limited. But that's all you really need to put, well, beef on the menu and to build the railways out to these ranching communities. So the free range system and the cattle drive system is really only necessary until you get rail extensions to everybody in the 1880s, and that's coming very quickly. Okay? Now, we're also going to not only just use the cattle drive business for just beef, we're going to utilize the whole carcass. Now, every cow, about half of it is marketable meat. What do we do with the rest of it? Well, the hides we're going to take and we're going to make leather with it. And if you've never experienced the old ways of tanning leather, that is truly an offensive and diabolical industry to live near or next to. You take the blood, you use that, you dry it out, you grind it up, you can use that for fertilizer. You chop the hooves off, you send that away, and you can render that down for glue. All of the fat off of the carcass, you render that for either soap or candles. Whatever's left, whatever meat, cartilage, offal is left, you can render that down and grind it up and turn it into sausages. You know, the slaughterhouses of the day, particularly in Chicago, become devastating for the environmental health of your cities because, well, your cows have been on a feedlot for a while. So their stomachs are full of stuff. Now, you can use the stomachs and you can use the intestines, but what do you do with the stomach contents? You open them up and you wash them out, and that goes out into the streets. That goes out into the gutters. That goes out into your drinking water. Okay? The products for tanning leather, where do those products go? Into your drinking water. It is truly one of those things in the Gilded Age. Our cities become horrific places to live because of a lack of an idea of environmental impact and sanitation. But that's coming for us, and we'll talk about that. But the cattle drive, such as it is, we're gonna put them on railway lines from the frontier, and we're gonna send them to Chicago, the Butcher House of America, and then we're gonna put them on a rail line to get them to Boston, to get them to New York and into Philadelphia, onto cold cars. And in a day, they can be from the frontier all the way into the markets of the East. So beef is on the menu, or as the commercials say, it's what's for dinner. Now, I made reference to this Manifest Destiny image. The Native Americans being chased away, the buffalo being chased away, the bear being chased away by your lone prospector. And then you've got your settlers, your farmers, your sod busters as they are. And then what do you have behind it? Stages. What do you have here? Rail lines. And what do you have way back here in the distance? Commerce, trade, eastern cities. This is Lady Columbia leading us on our manifest destiny west. In the census of 1890 and that Frederick Jackson Turner frontier thesis idea that the frontier was the source of American power, uniqueness, and economic wealth, and now it's closed. There's no more free land. That rugged individualistic idea that you could go out there with your two hands and build a life is gone. Where do you then turn? Some, including Teddy Roosevelt, and we'll continue to talk about Teddy Roosevelt. In the 1880s, he starts to make his name. In the 1890s, he really makes his name. The fact that we expand west and close our frontier and there's no more new lands to find, no more new resources to extract, that's going to force a shift in our thinking as we move into the 1890s and our focus. And as we shift that focus, we're going to start to look in a different direction. We're going to start to look further south. We're going to look west, okay, across the Pacific. And as we do that, that's going to open us up into other areas. But before we do that, the next lecture will cover the trifold factored industrialization, immigration, urbanization, We're going to start in the East, and we're going to continue to highlight how westward development and material resources coming from the West are going to fund and are going to fuel our rapid industrial development.